At the time, I was the chief astronaut. And I'll never forget, I'm driving to work one morning in my car, and I had the radio on, and the announcer comes up and says, "Hey, here's something interesting. As of this morning, Dr. Ray Seddon, who's in space aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia, has more time in space than her husband, the chief astronaut, Hoot Gibson." And I remember my first thought was, hey, this isn't news, this is drivel. Why are you... Well, anyway, it was an interesting statistic because at the time that I was chief astronaut, I had only flown 4 times. So I had 26 and a half days in space. She now had 30 days in space that morning. So she had more time in space than I did. How was your mission? You had 2 satellites you mentioned and some other things. So when did you launch? Did you or your husband launch first? Who got to go to space first, and did you have any kind of a wager on that?
No, my husband flew first. I flew second. But, I don't remember whether we had a wager on that or not. I figured I was definitely not going to go before you went.
We did have a wager, and I was betting that you were going to go first because we only had, how many women? 6. We had lots of boys. We had lots of boys in line and lots of boys there. So I was betting that you were going to go first, and you were betting that I was going to go first, but you don't remember what the bet was.
No. I'm afraid to ask.
No, well, it was 50 cents and a jelly donut.
Oh, 50 cents and a jelly donut. Yeah, that was frequently our bet.
That's what the bet was. So anyway, I guess I lost the bet because I was betting that you were going to go first. Yep. And I wound up flying the year before you did.
Right.
This will be the first trip in space for Lieutenant Colonel MacArthur. And here's our payload commander and mission specialist number 1, Dr. Ray Seddon. T-minus 7 minutes, 30 seconds, and the ground launch sequencer has initiated retraction of the orbiter crew access arm away from Columbia.
Engines are throttling back now, easing Columbia through the dense lower altitudes, but continuing to accelerate very rapidly. Columbia is already traveling over 650 miles per hour. Columbia continues to climb at a relatively steep angle at this point, tripling its rate of speed over the next minute. Solid rocket boosters, each delivering 3.3 million pounds of thrust, will burn out and separate at 2 minutes 3 seconds. Time now 1 minute 48 seconds. SRB chamber pressure is tailing off.
That was really beautiful, and we just want to tell you how much we've enjoyed working with all of you. You've sure been a help and a comfort to know that you're there, monitoring our systems, helping us, watching us, getting us through the difficult spots, and we really appreciate all the hard work.
And you were named fairly early in the scheme of things in the rotation,
right,
out of the 6 women.
Yes, I was named to go 3rd. And that didn't work out. The schedules changed and the flight assignments changed. So I ended up being 5th, I think, because the flight we were on was delayed and the shuttle schedule was changed around. And so I ended up being 5th, I think, out of the 6th. But that's okay. A space shuttle flight's a space shuttle flight. You don't worry that much about what order you went in. Of course, Sally Ride was put on she was the first woman to fly in space on the space shuttle. Judy Resnick was the second. Anna Fisher, I think, ended up third. Kathy was probably next, and then Shannon.
You were supposed to be the 3rd American woman to space, but because of delays in the program, you wound up being the 5th. So all of that trouble is out of the way, and the flight went off smoothly without a hitch, with nothing unusual whatsoever, right?
No.
Well, what
we
happened?
Had 2 fairly simple satellites that we had on board. And of course, we practiced and practiced and practiced. Jeff Hoffman was on the flight, and he was sort of my backup. You always had a primary and a backup. Backup was sort of supposed to watch you make all the switch throws. You always wanted to have a secondary person looking. So we had something called a SYNCOM satellite. It was a huge satellite that sat in our cargo bay right out the back window. And we were supposed to launch it, I think, probably on the first day up there, but early in the flight. So we got all ready. You have to put it out in a certain spot in space. So we made all our switch throws, and Jeff was watching, backing up, making sure I did everything right. And it came time to deploy the satellite. I pushed the button, and it rolled out of the cargo bay like it was supposed to. But then as it drifted away, it was supposed to spin itself up so it could be stabilized to get into a geosynchronous orbit around the Earth. And it didn't spin. And it had an antenna on the top that was supposed to pop up so the ground could send some commands, and that didn't happen. So, I was just worried that I had done something wrong. And Jeff said, no, you didn't do anything wrong. That's just a dead satellite. And there's nothing worse than you have planned and done everything right, and there's something wrong with the satellite. So we just figured, man, this is our first day up here, and it's a bad day. We're just going to have to come home, I guess. So towards the end of the first day, the ground came up, mission control came up and said, don't get any further away from that satellite. We have some ideas for you. We're going, what? Turned out that they thought that this little switch that was on the side of the satellite that was supposed to deploy when it came out of the cargo bay was stuck or didn't come out. So they had this crazy idea that maybe we could go and flip that switch and that would turn it all on. So we're thinking, right, how are we going to do that? Well, what they told us to do was go get all of this equipment out, and, they had no way of uplinking a picture to us of what they wanted. So they sent up, we had this teleprinter. It was this thing that just sort of typed out letters, and they could sort of draw a picture with the letters. And they said, we want you to do this and do this and do this. What they wanted was us to take some plastic book covers, tape them to the end of what we called a swizzle stick, which was a kind of a long metal rod that had an end on it that you could pop circuit breakers when you were sitting on in your seat for launch. And they said, well, saw off the top of the swizzle stick. And we're all looking at each other going, how do we do that? And I remembered in the medical kit we had something called a bone saw. I guess they thought we were going to saw off somebody's leg if it got caught someplace. But anyway, they said, well, get the bone saw out, saw off the end of that thing so we can tape these book covers to it. And all of us down on the middeck, Jeff Hoffman and I, and, probably Bo Bobko, our commander, they're going, if we saw this thing off, there's going to be all these metal scraps floating around. And that's terrible. We had a handheld vacuum cleaner. So Charlie Walker, one of our payload specialists, held the vacuum cleaner near the bone saw and the swizzle stick. And so that's what we did. We chopped off the end of this thing. And then we were told how to create this sort of thing that made our stick look like a fly swatter. And it had some little holes in it. And the idea was we were going to go into space and put the swizzle stick fly swatter on the end of the robot arm and then go to try and flip that switch on the side of the satellite. And Bo and all of us were looking at each other going, this is crazy. This is crazy. Who came up with this idea? Well, of course, we knew that all the folks in mission control were scurrying around trying to figure out how do we do this? Will it be safe? What do we have to tell the crew to do? So there were many, many moving parts. But Jeff and Dave got to go out and do a spacewalk and attach that thing to the end of a robot arm. Well, all the astronauts had some training, not all the astronauts, but usually 2 people on every flight had training in the spacesuits, and they could do certain things in the cargo bay. But Jeff Hoffman and Dave Griggs put on their spacesuits, went out the airlock, floated down to the end of the cargo bay, and attached this crazy-looking device to the end of the robot arm. So it was my job to raise the arm up, and Bo and Dave would get close to Bo and Don would get close to the satellite, and it was spinning, and I was supposed to put this fly swatter device up against the robot arm and see if we could jerk on it and make it come into the on position. Well, we tried a couple of times. It was a little bit scary because Bo and Don had really not planned or done much training in rendezvous. And rendezvousing from a big satellite with a big satellite in space, you don't just drive over there. There's all kinds of what they call orbital mechanics about, the way things move when they're free floating in gravity or outside of gravity. And so they were doing something that this was the first time that they had done it. And Jeff and I were trying to figure out, can we do this? Can we see this? Can we move the arm? And so all of this is going on, and the satellite is just looming big outside that back window. And I'm looking at this, and I thought, okay. I looked down through the interdeck access, which is a big hole that goes from the flight deck down to the middeck, and Jake Garn and Charlie Walker were down looking out that window when their eyes were about this big, thinking, what the heck are we doing?
If I remember right, the Syncom weighed about 16,000 pounds.
Yes, it was a huge satellite.
Huge.
It pretty much, at least round in the cargo bay, was about the size of the cargo bay, but not that thick.
About 15 feet diameter.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what the
so
cargo
it was
bay.
huge. And, we thought, oh, please, Lord, let us be able to do this. But we did the best we could do. It did not turn the satellite on.
Did you actually flip the switch? The answer is yes. You caught the switch a number of times.
I caught it a number of times.
With the fly
but it
swatter.
didn't turn it on.
It was already flipped all the way open. But there were those on the ground that were saying, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think she'll be able to do it.
Right.
But you
and I did it.
You did, didn't you?
I did it.
Yeah, she reached over with this fly swatter and grabbed that switch.
Caught it
several times on the fly
on the
swatter
plastic. Mm-hmm.
to where definitely put enough force on it that if it had been stuck just part way. But it wasn't. It was all the way. That was the only thing that you could do at the time, I guess.
Right. But it had started out to be a very simple flight, go up there and deploy a couple of satellites, come back home. But again, you never know what a flight like that is going to end up being like.
And it was interesting, too, because Dave Griggs was flying as a mission specialist, although he was selected as a space shuttle pilot. So he was going to be a space shuttle pilot on his next mission, but he was flying as a mission specialist. So I believe he is the only ever space shuttle pilot that got to do a spacewalk, got to do an EVA.
And it was wonderful after this was all over, and Dave was, after, I guess they had finished their spacewalk. Dave Griggs popped up in the aft windows of the shuttle, and you could just see through his helmet this big smile that they had gotten to go out and do a spacewalk. He wasn't going to get to fly the thing, but, second best was to be able to do a spacewalk.
So from there, the rest of the mission, everything just went fine. You came back to an uneventful landing back at Cape Canaveral, I guess, right?
Nope.
No.
No.
Well, what happened? Why was it not uneventful?
Well, we were coming in for a landing and everything looked great. Bo was flying the thing. We were going to land. There was a bit of a crosswind.
I had a great view as we came around the heading alignment turn on the final for runway 33 at the Cape. I was talking to Bo all the way around the turn relative to lineup and glide slope and energy management, and he was doing a great job of flying the airplane right around there. As we roll out on final here, I'll let him describe the landing.
It was a right crosswind. We touched down just a little bit to the left of the center line and drifted a little bit farther to the left with the crosswind. I put in a correction and brought it back to the center line. It handled beautifully. We rolled out with just a moderate braking and stopped with about 3,000 feet to go. We probably could have stopped a lot shorter if I had used a lot harder braking. At that point, we were all elated. We felt that we were really home. I mean, we had gone through this mission. We had done all of these things. Here we were rolling out. It was certainly under control. We were ready to stop and see our families and come home. What else could possibly go wrong? We, a few seconds later, felt one of the wheel brakes lock up, and it was no problem to control the vehicle. I mean, it was absolutely under control. There was no question about it, and you can see that. It didn't diverge at all. And then just about the time we came to a stop, the right tire blew.
And I was sitting down on the middeck, and all of a sudden we hear this bam. And we weren't quite sure what it was, and then things started to rattle. Turned out we had blown a tire. And we were lucky that we didn't skid off the runway or anything like that, but that was just kind of like, oh, perfect ending to this crazy flight. But, I think after that they changed the tires, didn't they?
No, what happened was at the time the nose wheel steering system was not usable.
Right.
So we just had a castering nose wheel, freewheeling castering nose wheel. So in a crosswind like that, the only thing you've got now to keep steering is the brakes. And so Bo was having to ride I think you blew a tire on the left side.
Right under my seat.
So he was having to ride the left brakes to keep the thing going straight. And you were lucky because you had slowed down to a slow enough speed that there wasn't a lot of negative lift from the wing, because it had always been said if we blow one of the tires on the main gear, the other tire won't be able to handle the load and it'll blow too, and you'll have two blown tires. So at that point you were in Discovery, and Discovery was slow enough that when the one tire blew, it didn't take out the other tire as well.
Yep.
So other than that, there was nothing that went wrong on your mission.
Exactly.
Other than those things. No.
But, it made it an interesting evolution, and it was wonderful to get back and talk to the people who had sent up all this information from us. What do they call them? Mechanical and something. There's a group in Mission Control.
IFM, in-flight
yes,
maintenance.
In-flight maintenance. And they had to work out, the fly swatter. They had sent people over to train in the water tank on doing the EVA. So there were many, many people involved in this flight. And it was fun to go back and talk to them and ask them about stuff, and they would ask us about stuff. And it was a good time to have a party.
So that was your flight in space. So you wound up with a total of 8 days in space, I guess, right?
No, that was just my first flight.
Before you flew again, we suffered the Challenger accident.
Yes.
And so you flew how many more times after Challenger?
2 times.
2 more times after Challenger. There were some astronauts that elected not to fly again after Challenger, but you made 2 more flights, and they were both concentrated space and life sciences missions.
Right. We carried Space Lab, which is sort of the size of a bus, in the back of the shuttle, and those were flights dedicated to the life sciences, which was of special interest to me. So It was very interesting to take those 2 flights later on. I felt like, I was using the training that I'd had before. The first flight was maybe a little bit of life sciences, but mostly, space shuttle stuff.
So you flew Space and Life Sciences 1, and then you flew as the payload commander
Right.
on Space and Life Sciences 2.
Yes.
So you made, your first flight was on Discovery, and then both of your Space and Life Sciences missions were aboard Columbia. So Columbia is the only orbiter that you and I both flew in our time at NASA.
True. Very true.
Well, you had a distinguished career as an astronaut, and then you moved on.
Well, there were other things that happened in my life. And then we had a baby. When he was born, there was a great deal of news that 2 astronauts had a baby, and he was dubbed the world's first astro-tot. So we thought that was kind of a cool thing to say. One of the newspaper folks made that up. So Paul takes great pride in being the world's first astro-tot.